I love Junji Ito's work. Not only do I immensely respect Junji Ito as an artist, but also as a writer. He manages to take aspects of daily life and human nature and twists them into horrifying stories, but never for the sake of just being horrifying or shocking. Most of his stories deal with aspects of society and culture, and that's one of the stories that I'll be covering today. Because just like many body horror stories, this particular one deals with a terrible fear and response that society and culture has towards a very serious issue: terminal illnesses. Before I start the video though, I want to say that this is half a response towards a video from Ragnarok's and half an analysis of my own. I will be mentioning his video a few times and his own analysis, so please watch his video first so you get the whole picture. And of course, with this video I mean no bad blood, his interpretation of the story and his own analysis are completely valid. However, while I really appreciate people who read between the lines of stories and never take stories at face value, I think this is a case of someone reading between the lines too much, which again, isn't entirely a bad thing, as many stories, despite having a quote-unquote true interpretation, can and will always be interpreted differently by different people. So, without further ado, let's begin. The story of Slug Girl begins with a narration from our deuteragonist, Ria. She narrates how her cousin Yuko has a sudden change in attitude lately. She's said to be really chatty, but right now she's unusually quiet. She seems lazy even when she's speaking, as her pronunciation of words is usually really bad. It is said that her condition has grown so bad that she stopped going to school altogether. So, Ria pays a visit to Yuko. When she arrives, she sees Yuko's parents attempting to solve their slug infestation problem on their backyard. Yuko's mother takes Ria inside to visit Yuko's room, and when they arrive they find Yuko with a mask on and her hands on her mouth, almost as if she's about to throw up or has been coughing. This kind of pose is pretty universal to signify sickness. Yuko's mother gets really worried, of course. However, Yuko reacts violently, screaming to both of them to just leave her alone and not bother her. It's at this time where Ria mentions that she saw a shocked and fearful reaction in Yuko's eyes. The same reaction she had when, while playing on her backyard, some of her friends scared her with slugs, an animal she hates, and ever since she never went near the backyard. When Ria shows up the next day to her house, Yuko's mom is in a panic, yelling for a doctor. Ria asks what happened, and that's when we see it. Yuko stands in front of both with a worried expression and a wide-eyed stare. She slowly opens her mouth to reveal the slug inside of her mouth. The slug starts to walk around Yuko's face as they all scream in terror. The slug is her own tongue, and it's not obeying her, her own body turning against her in the most horrible way possible. Yuko tries to call for help, but it's impossible, and while Yuko's mother screams in horror, Ria leaves horrified and disgusted and never came back. After this, Ria only knows what happened from Yuko's parents. It is said that she tried to cut off her tongue, but it grew back. No matter how much she mutilated her own body, it would not go away. Yuko's dad tried to kill the slug by pouring salt on it, but Yuko would spit it out. It is her own body after all. Whatever hurts the slug will hurt Yuko in return. And since she could not drink or eat, Yuko would slowly get worse and worse. Seeing as her own daughter may die in front of his eyes, Yuko's father decides to fill the bathtub with salt and let her own daughter go inside. Once inside, she's instructed to open her mouth. It will be tough for Yuko, but she must. Both her father and mother cheer Yuko to do it, confident that this will work. However, Yuko does not resurface, and when Yuko's father becomes increasingly worried, he starts to search for Yuko, but only finds her pajamas and underwear. That is, until he begins searching again. That's when he finds Yuko's head. With her body extremely shrunk due to the salt, they pour water with the hopes that she will return to normal, but only the slug remains. And so they watch as the slug carries their daughter's disembodied head around as a shell. Yuko is still around, in the backyard, as a shell of her former self, giving a sad gaze to anyone who may be nearby, making it unclear whether Yuko is completely dead, or perhaps still alive. So, after reading this incredibly depressing, shocking, and disturbing story, what can you say it's about? Well, let's take a look. In Ragnarok's video, he makes a valid analysis of the story. From his point of view, the story is about how society and culture treats people who are different. He claims that the slug in Yuko's mouth is what made Yuko different to other people, and since slugs are something that are stereotypically seen as disgusting and unwanted, this is an allegory for how people in our environment can, whether they mean to or not, abuse other people and create a hostile environment, an environment of bigotry against what is different and what they don't understand. He also claims that the 4 characters represent different facets of this issue, with her father representing rigid normativity and her mother representing compliance normativity, Rie representing compulsory normativity, and Yuko representing the people that are being affected by these actions. Now, while all these things do happen in real life, this is, in my own interpretation, not the point of the story, and I'll explain why. Let's go from the top. In my opinion, as the title suggests, this story is about terminal illnesses, or any illness at all. From the beginning, Yuko is seen as changed. She's not cheery or happy anymore. She's not chatty, she's quiet. She can't even speak and she looks lazy. Much like people with certain illnesses can lose their energy or their motivation, be it due to physical exhaustion or psychological exhaustion. When the problem becomes too much and she stops going to school altogether, we can assume she spends her days inside while her parents go about their normal slug-stumping, salt-pouring life, undisturbed in her own chamber until Rie comes home. That's when she goes into a panic. She doesn't want people to see her in this state. She herself feels like a monster because of her sickness, and because she's angry and frustrated with her situation, whether she wanted to or not, lashes out against people that try to help, much like people with illnesses may lash out against other people despite those people having the best intentions. And another story that exemplifies this even better is Silent Hill 2. Mary's character becomes more and more unstable as her sickness progresses. She has no hope of being better. She feels like a monster, and while James tries his best to cheer her up, she's so frustrated, so sad, so angry that she lashes out at James, saying things she does not mean. And these kind of actions can get worse if the other person leaves or lashes out back against the ill person, which may have a giant psychological toll on a person in such a vulnerable state, causing them to rapidly get worse. This happens when Rie finally sees what Yuko's problem is, when Yuko reveals, perhaps not by her own desires, that her tongue is that of a slug. Rie is disgusted by this sight. Either Rie or Yuko's mother acknowledge Yuko's suffering by mentioning that she has slugs, which Yuko hates, running around in her mouth, but they also use the words poor Yuko, meaning that they don't hate Yuko for being different, but rather they feel sorry for Yuko, because they know that Yuko does not feel okay with this situation, which would be completely different if this was a story about being different, in which case the slug wouldn't be a separate entity from Yuko, it would just be Yuko herself. However, in this case, the slug is not only something that Yuko hates and cannot control, but it's also something that damages Yuko indirectly by not allowing her to eat or drink, things that are necessary for survival. Not only that, but accompanied is the self-mutilation aspect of the story. Now, I'm no expert on any medical field, but I wouldn't say it's outlandish to say that people who have illnesses, perhaps an illness on a particular limb, can reach such a degree and take such a giant toll on someone's psyche that they either think or do attempt to cut off their limbs to get rid of the issue. Whatever the case is, my point is that I don't think it's crazy to believe that certain illnesses can lead people to cause self-harm for whatever reason. In this case, Yuko cuts off her own tongue, trying to get rid of the thing that's harming her body, but she can't, because that thing is her body, and it keeps growing back. You can't just take it out of you no matter how hard you try. And this happens when Yuko's father tries to pour salt into her mouth too. The slug is part of Yuko. Whatever hurts the slug hurts Yuko too. This is the part of the story where Ragnaroks mentions how the father embodies traditional manly values by pouring salt into her daughter's mouth or making her daughter submerge herself into a bath of salt. This is like trying to fix a car and how these are brute force methods. Additionally, he mentions that Yuko's mother is compliant on this by being undecisive and doubting of his methods. However, I believe this is a case of people reading too much into the story. I am no expert on Japanese culture, but considering how from the outside Japanese culture seems too traditional, I wouldn't say it's too crazy to think that this is just how traditional Japanese families work. The father is the one that takes action, while the mother helps and, being a mother, worries for her children. Lastly, he mentions how Rie is compulsory normativity. He mentions that while Yuko poses no threat to her whatsoever, she repeatedly disappears and runs away, disgusted by her. Again, this is, I believe, a case of people reading too much into it. What I believe Rie represents is how many people react to people with clear illnesses, or maybe a physical deformity, by showing disgust and fear of it. This added to the fact that Yuko reacts in a violent way whenever people are around her while she's in this state. It's pretty easy to come to the conclusion that Rie simply represents the part of society that is disgusted and scared of illnesses. You know, the sort of people that, if they come across a person with a visible condition, would either walk very far away from that person, or would cross the street, perhaps even run away in the most extreme of cases. The idea that this is a story about an illness becomes more supported by the fact that the slug takes away something that is vital for Yuko's survival: eating and drinking. I'm not exactly sure what kind of illnesses can take something so vital away from you, but I'm pretty sure there are some, unfortunately. It's clear that Yuko's parents do not show disgust towards Yuko herself. They care deeply for Yuko because, well, it's their daughter. They want to eradicate the slug, and that's why, as Ragnarok suggests, the father has this "we have to fix her" mentality, because they really do have to fix her. The slug is not only something that Yuko hates, but as mentioned previously, it's harming her indirectly by not allowing her to drink or eat anything at all. Now, this is the part of the analysis where this comes to interpretation of the reader. What I interpret the last part of the story as is a family trying their hardest to keep a family member around, despite there being no hope for that person. In the same way you would try to support and cheer up a person doing your best to lift their spirits and fight against the illness, Yuko's parents cheer her up to step into the salt so she can defeat the slug. The salt bathtub experiment fails, and Yuko remains only as a head. However, they keep her head around. They don't throw the slug out or kill it. Instead, they watch as the slug slowly comes out of Yuko's mouth and transports her back into the place she hated the most, the backyard. And there she will stay, her sad gaze symbolizing, in my own interpretation, how the patient of a terminal illness would see other people that keep them around, despite there being no hope for that person. You can, of course, interpret that last bit of the story in whatever way you want. However, that's what I interpreted the story as, a tale about illnesses and how society reacts to them by showing disgust, fear, running away, and how others act when confronted by a close one being struck by an illness, trying everything you can to help, maybe accidentally harming the person by doing something that you thought would help, just like the father hurt Yuko by throwing salt at her mouth, thinking that it would kill the slug. And of course, this being a body horror story, how could it ever be about the marginalization of an individual? If anything, it's about empathizing with the individual. That's what the body horror genre is all about, because the violation of your own body becoming something that you hate, having your own body not answer to your commands, becoming a shell of yourself, is something that we can all understand. It's a fear that we all share equally. Of course, again, all my own interpretation, and once again, I want to clarify that by this I mean no disrespect towards Ragnarok's or his own interpretation. While I have a different interpretation of this story, his analysis and his own are not less valid. If you made it this far, I just want to thank you so much for watching. This is a kind of video that I was very excited to make. Very short one, not a lot of giant production value, it's just the same kind of video that I made on the Naruto video. It's just the kind of video that I always really liked, analyzing stories, picking them apart, explaining them, quote unquote, putting out my own interpretation out there, creating some discussion around the story and all that. So yeah, I was very excited to make this kind of video. So once again, thank you so much if you made it to the end. If you'd like, please check my social media to see my art, what I'm up to, all that. And I'll see you on the next one.